Hey, look at me, not at the water. Tell me your name. Mine's long. I'll trade you. It was 6:10 on a gray April morning on Mapo Bridge, the Han River pewter and slow beneath the rail, when Foleke Adeyemi, out on her usual run, saw a schoolboy standing on the wrong side of it. She had been a national-level swimmer once, before an injury and an empty bank account rewrote her future, and she still moved through crisis the way she had been trained to move through a false start, steady, unhurried, no wasted motion. The sensible thing would have been to give her name afterward, let a grateful family write a check, let the city call her a hero for a week. What she did instead, 4 lines left blank on a paramedic's form, cost the most powerful man in Yoido a full year of searching for a stranger he never saw clearly enough to describe. Across the river, in a glass tower in Yoido, Han Ji-suk was 30 minutes into a shareholder call when his phone buzzed with a number he did not recognize, a hospital, asking if he was the guardian of a Min Jae-han. He would remember later that he asked the caller to repeat the boy's name twice, as if repetition might change the answer. Min Jae was 15, a good student turning quietly worse since the divorce, and that morning he had left for school an hour early, telling no one where he was actually going. His father knew the shape of the boy's exhaustion without ever asking its cause. By the time Ji-suk reached the hospital, his son was breathing on his own, wrapped in a blanket, and utterly unable to describe the woman who had gone into the river after him. By evening, Foleke was coughing in a cold apartment with a dead phone and a laptop that would never turn on again, its drive holding 11 months of unfinished thesis work. She told herself the loss was the price of a Tuesday morning, nothing more, and did not report it to anyone who might ask her name in return. Min Jae remembered almost nothing clearly except her voice, low, unhurried, faintly accented, and a woven bracelet on her wrist, a pattern of red and gold thread that had slipped off somewhere in the water and washed up tangled in his own sleeve. He kept it in his desk drawer for a year, without knowing what to call the feeling of owing his life to someone whose face he could not draw. This is the story of a rescue that both of them tried to keep small. Foleke because a blank line on a form felt safer than a name attached to an uncertain visa, and Ji-suk because the only thing he had left to search with was patience and a piece of thread. It follows a year of missed corridors and near misses across Seoul, a boy who found her before his father did, a pool where gratitude slowly became trust, a boardroom that wanted her story for its own reasons, and a bracelet returned exactly once it had stopped mattering whether anyone said thank you out loud. It ends, as these things sometimes do, at the edge of water again, this time by choice. Foleke Adeyemi ran the same 4 kilometers along the Han every morning before her 6 o'clock lifeguard shift at the district pool, a habit that had survived the injury, survived leaving Nigeria, survived 2 years of graduate coursework that ate her sleep. The river at that hour belonged to delivery trucks and a handful of other runners, all of them moving in the private rhythm of people who had somewhere to be. She noticed the boy the way she noticed everything from a poolside chair, peripherally first, then completely. He was on the outer edge of the railing at the middle of Mapo Bridge, one hand loose on the rail behind him, still in his school uniform though it was far too early for class. Nothing about his posture was dramatic. That was what made her slow to a walk instead of a run, because drama she could have driven past, and stillness she could not. She did not call for help, there was no one close enough to matter, and she had learned, in 9 years of competitive swimming, that panic in another body plus panic in your own voice was the fastest way to lose someone. She simply came level with him, 30 feet off, and started talking in the same tone she used to steady 8-year-olds at the shallow end. Hey, look at me, not at the water. She kept her voice easy, almost bored, the way you'd talk to someone about to miss a bus rather than someone about to make an irreversible choice. The boy's eyes moved to her without much interest, the eyes of someone who had already spent everything he had on getting to that railing and had nothing left over for a stranger. Tell me your name, she said, closing another 10 feet, hands visible, no sudden angles. Mine's long, and nobody here can pronounce it right, so it's only fair. He didn't answer. She kept walking, kept talking, filled the space with ordinary sentences about the cold, about how her toes went numb on mornings like this, about nothing that asked anything of him except attention. Later, she would not be able to explain why she felt certain he was listening, even when his face gave her nothing. What she would remember instead was the exact second his attention flickered toward the water below, the small shift in his weight that any lifeguard learns to read before the swimmer himself understands what his body has decided to do, and the half-second in which she was already moving before he was. His hand slipped, or he let it slip, or the wet rail simply decided for him. Afterward, no one, including the boy, would be certain which, and he went over backward with the flat, boneless drop of someone who hadn't braced for the height. Folake didn't scream his name, because she didn't have it yet. She dropped her running bag on the walkway, phone and half-dead laptop and all, and went over the same railing a breath behind him, feet first, arms crossed over her chest the way she'd been taught before she'd been taught anything else in a pool. The Han in April was colder than it looked from the bridge, cold enough to punch the air out of her on impact, and the current under the surface was stronger than the flat gray skin suggested. She surfaced already searching, found the pale shape of his blazer 8 meters downstream, and swam for it with the stroke that had once qualified her for a national final she never got to swim, because a torn shoulder and an empty family bank account had made that decision for her long before this river did. Getting him was the easy part. A strong swimmer in cold water usually is. Keeping his head up while the current pulled at both of them, and finding the strength in a shoulder that had never fully healed to haul him the last few meters to a concrete embankment, was not. She got him onto flat ground, rolled him, found no breath, and started compressions with the count she had drilled 100 times on mannequins and never once believed she would need on a real chest that felt, under her hands, disturbingly like a child's. She did not stop when her own body began to shake from the cold. She did not stop when a jogger finally saw them and started shouting into a phone. She counted, breathed for him, counted again, and on the 4th cycle he coughed river water onto the pavement and started breathing on his own, eyes open but unfocused. No idea yet whose hands had just given his life back to him. The ambulance took 4 more minutes to arrive. In all 4 of them, Folake stayed exactly where she was, soaked and shaking, one hand still resting on his sternum, as if letting go might undo what had just been done. The paramedics took over with the brisk efficiency of people who did this daily, checking pupils, checking pulse, wrapping the boy in a foil blanket while asking Folake questions she answered in clipped half-sentences. Yes, she'd pulled him out. Yes, she'd done compressions. No, she didn't know him. One of them tried to wrap a second blanket around her shoulders. She waved it off and asked instead whether her bag, abandoned on the walkway above, might still be there. It was, eventually, but the phone inside had taken on enough water through a cracked seam to die within the hour, and the laptop, her laptop, with 11 months of a thesis on post-colonial water rights policy that existed nowhere else, because she had never trusted the campus cloud drive enough to pay for it, never turned on again. She would not fully understand the size of that loss until days later, sitting in front of a blank screen with a recovery quote from a technician that cost more than she had. For now, soaked to the skin and coughing, she watched a second ambulance crew lift the boy onto a gurney and understood only that she needed, very badly, to be somewhere else before anyone asked her full name. A police officer arriving behind the paramedics asked, not unkindly, whether she could stay to give a statement, and Folake said she had a shift to make, which was not quite a lie. Her contract at the district pool started at 6, and it was already 10 minutes past. She gave her first name only, watched the officer write it down with visible uncertainty about the spelling, and left before he could ask for anything harder to verify, like a student visa that technically restricted the hours she was allowed to work and did not mention emergency river rescues as an exception. By the time she reached the pool, her uniform swimsuit soaked under her clothes, a cough had started low in her chest, tight and unfamiliar. She told her supervisor she'd fallen in during her run, which was true in every detail except the order of events, and spent the morning shift feeling the cold settle deeper into her lungs with every whistle she blew. She did not yet know that the boy behind her that morning was the son of a man whose name appeared, that same week, on 3 different business headlines she would never read. The cough became a fever within 3 days, and the fever became a diagnosis. Aspiration pneumonia, the doctor said. Not unusual after cold water immersion and a chest full of river. That put Folake in a hospital bed of her own for 4 nights and in her apartment, unable to stand for more than a few minutes at a time, for 10 more after that. She missed 11 consecutive lifeguard shifts. The pool's part-time contract, which had never offered sick leave because it had never been designed for someone who might need it, was reassigned to another student in her second week of fever. A decision relayed to her in a 2-line message she read through a headache so severe she couldn't argue with it even if she'd wanted to. No one from the hospital where the boy had been taken ever called to check on the stranger who'd pulled him out, because no one there had her name to call. She lay in a borrowed apartment with a dead laptop, a disconnected phone, and a chest that ached with every breath, and told herself, with the same flat certainty she'd used to walk away from a torn shoulder years earlier, that this too was simply the cost of the thing she'd chosen. By the time the second ambulance pulled away with the boy inside, a small crowd had gathered on the embankment path. Dog walkers, 2 delivery cyclists, a woman in hospital scrubs coming off a night shift, all of them looking for the person who had apparently gone into the Han and come out again with a stranger's son. Folake was already 40 meters up the path by then, wringing water from her sleeves, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who had decided that attention was a second emergency to be managed. One of the paramedics, writing his report against the ambulance door, noted a female bystander, unnamed, performed CPR prior to arrival, patient regained spontaneous breathing at scene, and left a blank line under witness contact where a name should have gone, because she had already turned the corner off the embankment before he thought to ask twice. It was, in its way, a precise mirror of the boy's own morning. 2 people the city had nearly lost within an hour of each other, one of them walking away before anyone could properly thank her, the other unable yet to remember who had asked for his name in the first place. Folake did fill out one form that morning, though not at the boy's hospital. The district pool required an incident log for any rescue performed on or off shift, a bureaucratic reflex she'd learned to respect. 4 lines waited for her at the bottom: witness name, contact number, notes, signature. She wrote the notes in full, clinical detail, the kind of report a former athlete gives without embellishment. The other 3 lines she left empty, and when her supervisor asked why, she said only that she preferred not to be listed anywhere a journalist might find her, which was true, though not the whole truth. The whole truth included a visa clause about permitted working hours she wasn't certain an unpaid river rescue would violate, and a colder fact underneath that: 2 years earlier, back home, a single newspaper photograph of an injured swimmer had followed her from city to city until she'd stopped entering competitions altogether, rather than keep explaining what the picture meant. She had learned, the hard way, that being seen and being safe were not the same thing. What she did not yet know was that somewhere across the river, a father was about to build an entire year of searching around exactly the blank space she'd left behind. The bracelet came off somewhere in the last few meters of the swim to the embankment, though Folake never felt it go. Cold water numbs a wrist long before it registers a loss. It was a narrow band of woven red and gold thread, a pattern her younger sister Bisi had taught herself from their grandmother, and then tied onto Folake's wrist the week she left Lagos for Seoul, half joke and half insurance, the kind of gift meant to survive longer than the homesickness it was made to answer. A paramedic found it tangled in the cuff of the boy's soaked blazer while cutting the fabric away in the ambulance, assumed it was his, and bagged it with his other personal effects without a second thought. It would sit in a hospital property envelope for 6 days before anyone thought to ask whether a 15-year-old boy owned a hand-woven Yoruba pattern bracelet in a size too small for his own wrist, and by then the only person who could have explained it was already back at work, checking whether the pool would let her return part-time now that her one job had been given away. The hospital's security office pulled footage from 3 cameras covering the embankment path at Han Ji-suk's request, made through an assistant on his second day of near-constant calls to anyone who might know something. All 3 showed the same grainy story from different angles. A woman in dark running clothes crossing the frame at speed, entering the water, and reappearing with a second shape a full 90 seconds later, too far from any lens to resolve a face. One camera caught her walking away just after 6 that same morning, a bag over one shoulder, and then nothing. She left the frame at the edge of the path and never reappeared on any other feed the investigators checked. It was, an analyst told Ji-suk apologetically, roughly the visual information you'd get from a police sketch drawn by someone who'd glimpsed a person through fog. Height, build, the fact of dark skin and dark clothing, nothing that would hold up to an actual search. He kept the printed stills anyway, 3 blurred frames in a folder he would carry into meetings for the next year, next to a small evidence bag containing a bracelet no one in his family recognized. Han Ji-suk reached the hospital at 11 that morning, having left a shareholder call mid-sentence, driven himself rather than wait for a car, and arrived to find his son alive, breathing, wrapped in 2 blankets, and refusing to look at him directly. The attending doctor's report used careful, clinical language: fall from height into water, bystander-initiated resuscitation, full recovery expected, that told Ji-suk everything about what had happened to his son's body, and almost nothing about what had happened in the days leading up to it. He sat by the bed for an hour without either of them saying much, the silence itself a kind of confession about how long it had been since they'd talked about anything that mattered. When a nurse mentioned, almost in passing, that the woman who'd pulled Min-jae from the river had left without giving her name, Ji-suk felt something in his chest tighten that had nothing to do with relief. He asked to see whatever footage existed. He asked whether she'd been hurt. He asked 3 separate times over the following hour whether anyone had thought to write down anything at all, and each time the answer was the same careful, apologetic no. The doctor who examined Min-jae used a phrase Ji-suk would turn over for months afterward. "We recommend a psychiatric consultation before discharge, standard after an incident like this," spoken with the flat neutrality of someone accustomed to parents who did not want to hear it. Ji-suk had spent 14 months since the divorce operating on the assumption that his son's silences were ordinary teenage weather, that grades dipping from top of the class to merely good were a phase, that a boy who ate dinner in his room and answered questions in single syllables was simply 15. He had not asked, because asking would have required him to sit with an answer he suspected he already knew and had chosen not to examine. Now a stranger who had never met either of them had gone into cold water for a son whose own father had not noticed him disappearing in slower, quieter ways for over a year. He did not say any of this out loud, not yet, not to the doctor and not to Min-jae. He simply signed the consent for the consultation and began, without knowing it yet, the long process of learning to ask questions he was afraid to hear answered. By the end of the first week, Ji-suk had assigned 2 members of his company's security team, technically meant for supply chain due diligence, to the sole task of identifying the woman in the blurred footage. It was, he would admit much later, an entirely disproportionate response to the problem of finding someone to thank. But thanking her was not, if he was honest, the whole of what drove him. Building a search was something he understood. Spreadsheets of hospital shift logs cross-referenced against nearby employers, a list of every public and private pool within 3 kilometers of the bridge, a standing request to be notified of any new CCTV pulled from the district. These were tasks with clear steps and measurable progress, unlike the far harder work of sitting across from his son and asking what had actually driven him to that railing. He told himself the search was for the woman's sake, so she could be properly thanked and never worry about money again. It would take him most of a year to admit that finding her had also become the one part of his son's crisis he felt equipped to do something about. Folake had been 17 when a National Swimming Federation scout first clocked her time in the 200-meter freestyle and told her parents, in the careful language people use around a family's one visible hope, that she might swim for Nigeria within 3 years. She trained before school and after it in a public pool in Lagos with peeling lane ropes until a shoulder injury at 19 and a family account that could no longer cover physiotherapy closed that door within the same 6 months. She had not touched competitive swimming again after that, not out of bitterness exactly, but because grief needed somewhere to not be looked at, and she had rebuilt herself instead around research, water policy, infrastructure, the unglamorous mechanics of who gets clean water and who doesn't, that had eventually carried her to a graduate program in Seoul and a part-time lifeguard contract that paid just enough to keep her visa current. She had told almost no one in Korea about the swimming. It was easier, she had found, to be a competent stranger with no history than to explain a life that had once pointed somewhere else entirely. Min Jae's memory of the morning came back to him in pieces over the following weeks, none of them in order. A voice telling him her name was too long for anyone to pronounce right, the specific cold of water closing over his head, a pressure on his chest that hurt in a way that felt, oddly, like being brought back rather than pushed under. He remembered a bracelet on her wrist, red and gold thread, because he'd stared at it while she talked to him, needing somewhere to put his eyes that wasn't the water below. He did not tell his father everything he remembered, partly because some of it belonged to a version of that morning he wasn't ready to explain, and partly because he had started, quietly and without telling anyone, his own search, not through security logs or CCTV, but by watching, whenever he passed a pool or a river path, for a woman who moved like she'd once been trained for something bigger than her ordinary day. He did not know yet that his father's investigators and his own instinct would eventually lead to the very same water. Dr. Choi, the psychiatrist Min Jae saw twice a week after his discharge, suggested something that struck Ji-suk as counterintuitive at first: controlled, gentle exposure to water, in a safe setting with no expectations attached, as part of rebuilding trust in his own body, rather than avoiding the site of his crisis altogether. A community pool in Sogang, unremarkable and inexpensive, ran a quiet weekday program for exactly this kind of recovery, mixed in among children's lessons and elderly aqua aerobics classes, deliberately unglamorous, no press, no pressure to perform. Min Jae resisted the idea for 2 full sessions, sitting fully dressed on the pool deck while other people swam laps around him, until on the 3rd visit he finally lowered himself into the shallow end and stood there, chest deep, breathing, doing nothing more dramatic than existing in water without panic for the first time since April. He did not notice, that first week, the volunteer coach working with a group of children in the next lane, her voice pitched low and unhurried in a way that would take him 3 more sessions to place. It was the 4th week before something in Min Jae's chest went suddenly, uncomfortably tight during a session, and he could not immediately say why, only that the volunteer coach in the next lane had told a nervous 8-year-old to look at her, not at the water, in a tone so specifically familiar that he stopped mid-stroke and had to be reminded by his own instructor to keep moving. He watched her for the rest of the session without meaning to, the economical way she moved along the pool edge, the woven bracelet visibly absent from a wrist that still, out of habit, seemed to expect it, the accent underneath her Korean that placed her somewhere in West Africa. He did not approach her. He was 15 and uncertain and terrified in a way that had nothing to do with water of being wrong, of building an entire fragile hope around a stranger's ordinary kindness to a frightened child. He told no one that week, not his father, not Dr. Choi, and spent every session after that quietly, carefully watching a woman he was almost certain had once pulled him out of a river. Over the following weeks, Min Jae found small, deniable ways to be near the volunteer coach's lane, arriving a few minutes early, staying a few minutes late, once asking her directly, with elaborate casualness, whether she'd ever swum competitively, because something about her stroke looked trained rather than merely capable. Folake answered honestly, the way she generally did, that she had, years ago, before an injury ended it, and watched a strange, careful attention cross the boy's face that she filed away without understanding. She did not recognize him. The morning on the bridge had been a blur of cold and adrenaline, and a boy's face half turned from her the entire time. She had spent more time looking at his hands, checking his grip, than at his features. What she noticed instead, without being able to name it, was that this particular student watched her with an intensity none of the other children in the program did, as if he were double-checking something against a memory, rather than simply learning to swim. She assumed, when she thought about it at all, that he was simply a serious kid working hard at something difficult, which was, in its own way, not entirely wrong. The confirmation when it came was almost anticlimactic. Min-jae watched her count a lap start under her breath, the same unhurried four-count rhythm she'd used to talk him back from the railing, and something in him simply stopped doubting. He did not tell his father immediately. He had thought, in the abstract, about what finding her would mean. A reward, a headline, a company statement, all the machinery his father's world tended to build around anything worth thanking someone for, and some instinct, sharper than he could explain at 15, told him that machinery would frighten her away faster than gratitude would draw her close. He decided, sitting on the pool deck with his towel around his shoulders, that he would talk to her first, alone, without cameras or investigators or his father's careful corporate language, and only afterward decide what, if anything, to tell anyone else. It took him another full week to work up to it. When he finally did, he did not plan a speech. He simply waited until the pool had mostly emptied, sat down on the edge near her equipment bag, and asked if her name was Folake. She went very still when he said it, the particular stillness of someone recalculating an entire situation in half a second, and asked, carefully, how he knew that. "You told me on the bridge," Min-jae said. "I didn't forget, I just couldn't find you." He said it without drama, the way you'd report a fact rather than perform a feeling, and something in the plainness of it undid more of her guard than tears would have. She asked him, first, whether he was all right, not whether he remembered her, not whether he'd told anyone, but whether he was actually, presently all right. And he said mostly, working on it, which was truer than fine would have been. She admitted when he asked that she'd left her name off every form on purpose, that she had reasons that were complicated and mostly about paperwork and partly about not wanting to be a story in a newspaper again. He asked her not to disappear, not for his father's sake or anyone else's, just because he'd spent a year wondering if she was real. She said she wouldn't, and understood, even as she said it, that she had just made a promise considerably larger than she'd intended to. Min-jae told his father that same evening, carefully, leaving out nothing except his own hesitation, and watched something in Jisuk's face move through disbelief, relief, and a fierce, immediate need to see her in the space of about 10 seconds. He asked to come to the pool the following week, and Min-jae, after negotiating a promise of no cameras and no security detail, agreed. Jisuk arrived in a suit, having come straight from a meeting he'd cut short without explanation, and stood at the edge of a public pool full of splashing 8-year-olds looking, by his own later admission, entirely out of place. A man used to rooms that quieted when he entered, standing awkwardly near a lifeguard chair while children's swim goggles bobbed past his expensive shoes. Folake spotted him before Min-jae pointed him out, recognized the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to make a scene, and felt her guard go up several notches before either of them had said a word. Whatever this conversation was about to become, she intended to control the terms of it herself. He thanked her first, plainly, without the rehearsed quality she'd half expected from a man who ran press conferences for a living, and then he offered her money, a figure large enough that a lesser negotiator would have paused before naming it, framed as gratitude, as nothing she needed to feel strange about accepting. Folake said no immediately, flatly, in a tone that closed the subject rather than opening it for discussion. "I didn't pull him out for a reward," she said. "If you pay me now, it turns into something I did for a check, and it wasn't that." Jisuk, unused to being refused by anyone, tried once more, gently, and got the same answer delivered with slightly more edge. He recognized, watching her, the particular quality of a person who had drawn a line and intended to hold it regardless of the number attached to crossing it, a rarity, in his experience, among people he'd ever offered money to. He left the pool that day without having given her anything, which bothered him considerably more than writing the check would have. He came back 2 weeks later, alone, without an offer of money in hand, and asked instead what the program actually needed, a question specific enough that Folake understood he'd done some homework rather than simply performing concern. She told him, because it was true and because refusing to answer would have felt like its own kind of vanity. Second-hand kickboards held together with tape, a filtration system old enough that the district kept threatening to close the pool for repairs it couldn't fund. No budget at all for the scholarship spots that let low-income kids swim for free. She was careful to describe all of it as the program's need, not her own, and watched him note every detail without writing anything down, the way people do when they've already decided to act and don't need a list to remember why. It was the first conversation between them that had nothing to do with the bridge at all, and the first time she caught herself thinking of him as a specific, complicated person, rather than simply the father of a boy she'd once pulled from a river. Within a month, new equipment appeared at the pool through a district grant that no one, including the district office itself, could quite trace to a source, along with a maintenance contract that fixed the filtration system before it became the emergency everyone had been expecting. Folake suspected immediately where it had come from and said nothing, partly out of stubbornness and partly because objecting to help that flowed to children rather than to her felt like a harder line to defend. Ji-seok began attending Min-jae's sessions more regularly than his schedule strictly allowed, sitting on the same pool deck bench each time, watching Folake work with a patience and specificity he recognized from nowhere else in his life. The way she corrected a stroke without embarrassing the child attempting it, the way she noticed which kids were tired before they knew it themselves. He did not tell her he was watching her as closely as he was watching his son. He was not entirely sure, if asked, that he could have separated the two anymore. It was the closest thing to a gift she had allowed herself to accept from him, disguised carefully as something meant for the children instead. The sessions became, without anyone quite planning it, the place where Ji-seok and Min-jae started talking again in ways that had nothing to do with grades or schedules. Something about the neutral ground of the pool deck and Folake's steady presence a few meters away made it easier to say difficult things out loud than it had ever been across the dinner table at home. Min-jae told his father, in fragments over several weeks, about the weight he'd been carrying since the divorce. Not blame exactly, but a persistent sense that he'd become an afterthought to two parents each rebuilding a separate life, and an academic pressure at school that had started to feel less like ambition and more like the only thing anyone still seemed to want from him. Ji-seok listened more than he spoke, which was, Folake noted from a distance, a new skill for him. She never inserted herself into these conversations directly, but she made sure, without being asked, that there was always a lane free and a quiet corner of deck available whenever father and son needed one. Word of the CEO's personal involvement with an unidentified rescuer reached the Ilsong Group's board through channels Ji-seok had not authorized, and Director Oh raised it at the next quarterly meeting with the careful neutrality of a man delivering bad news as a favor. The concerns, as Oh laid them out, were twofold. First, that details of Min-jae's fall might surface publicly in a form the company could not control, framed as a mental health crisis in the chairman's own family. Second, that an unverified foreign national with an uncertain visa status was now receiving what looked, from certain angles, like preferential company funding. Neither concern was stated as an accusation, exactly, and Oh was careful to note he was raising it out of duty rather than malice. But Ji-seok heard, underneath the careful language, an unmistakable suggestion that the whole matter be handled quietly before it became a liability. He said only that he would take it under advisement and left the meeting with the first real understanding of how much pressure was about to come to bear on a woman who had asked him for nothing but a working filtration system. Folake's own pressure arrived from a different direction entirely, Her thesis advisor, hearing an incomplete version of the story from a colleague, suggested, not unkindly, that going public with what she'd done could strengthen her case for a research visa extension that was otherwise looking uncertain, given a lost laptop, a missed semester of full productivity, and a funding gap she hadn't fully explained to the department. It was on paper sound practical advice, the kind of calculation she might have made without hesitation 2 years earlier, back when a photograph following her from city to city hadn't yet taught her what visibility could cost. She sat with the advice for several days, doing the arithmetic of her own precarity honestly, a visa deadline in 5 months, a program that valued attention over quiet competence, a version of herself that could simply say yes and solve several problems at once. She said no anyway, for reasons she found harder to explain to her advisor than she expected, and spent that night on the phone with her sister trying to work out whether stubbornness and principle were, in her case, actually the same thing. Dr. Choi's office became, over several sessions that spring, the place where Jisuk finally asked his son the question he'd been avoiding since the hospital: what, specifically, had brought him to that railing, and had he thought about it before that particular morning? Min-jae answered slowly, in the careful language Dr. Choi had helped him build over weeks, about a version of himself that had stopped believing his effort changed anything, not just at school, where his grades had quietly declined despite working harder than ever, but at home, where two parents building separate new lives seemed to have less and less room in them for the son they'd built together first. He said he hadn't planned that particular morning exactly, only that it had felt, standing on the bridge, like the first decision in over a year that was entirely his own to make. Jisuk did not defend himself, did not explain the divorce from his side, did not do any of the things a less exhausted, less frightened man might have reached for. He said only that he was sorry, plainly, and that he intended to keep showing up until his son believed he meant it. Folake called her sister Bisi that same week, on the new phone she'd finally been able to afford, and admitted something she hadn't said out loud to anyone since arriving in Seoul, that turning down Jisuk's money hadn't only been about principle, it had also been about fear. The fear that accepting help meant owing someone an explanation of who she was before the injury, before the pool, before she'd learned to be a competent stranger with no history worth asking about. Bisi, who had woven the bracelet in the first place and still remembered exactly which national final her sister never got to swim, said something Folake turned over for days afterward, that refusing every kindness wasn't the same thing as strength, it was just a different kind of hiding, dressed up to look like a boundary. Folake didn't have a clean answer for that. She sat with the accusation the way she'd once sat with a diagnosis that ended a career, turning it over for a weakness she could work around, and found, for the first time in 2 years, that she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to keep hiding at all. Yoon Se-ra, a reporter who covered both business and human interest stories for a mid-sized Seoul outlet, had been quietly chasing the story for 3 months by the time she had enough to write it. A hospital intake report with a blank witness line, a second-hand account from a paramedic willing to describe a woman in dark running clothes, and, most usefully, an off-the-record comment from someone inside Ilsong Group about the chairman's unusual personal interest in a community pool program. She did not have Folake's name yet, but she had enough to know a Nigerian woman was involved, enough to know the CEO's son had nearly drowned, enough to sketch the outline of a headline about a mystery angel of the Han that she knew, with the flat professional certainty of someone who'd built a career on stories like this, would perform extremely well. She told her editor she was close. She did not yet fully understand how close she was to breaking apart something 3 people had spent months carefully rebuilding. She found Folake outside the community pool on an ordinary Tuesday, introduced herself with a business card and a smile calibrated for exactly this kind of encounter, and asked, without much preamble, whether she was the woman who had pulled Han Min-jae from the Han River in April. Folake's first reaction was not fear exactly, but a cold, immediate recalculation of every safeguard she'd built over the past year. Her visa status, her advisor's advice she'd already refused once, the specific vulnerability of being a foreign national with an uncertain immigration timeline suddenly named in print. She said carefully that she had no comment and walked back inside faster than her usual pace, hands not quite steady on the door. She called Min-jae's number before she'd even reached the locker room, not to accuse him of anything, but because some old instinct told her that whatever door had just opened had opened somewhere close to the people she'd started, cautiously, to trust. Her hands were still not steady by the time he picked up, and for the first time since the bridge, she found herself needing someone else to tell her what to do next. The story reached Director Oh before it reached Ji-seok directly, through the outlet's standard request for comments sent to the company's press office, and the board's response split cleanly along a line Ji-seok found more revealing than he expected. Half wanted the story killed outright, citing risk to the chairman's image. The other half, led by Oh, with a different kind of pragmatism, wanted the opposite: lean into it, offer Yoon Se-ra an exclusive, frame the community pool funding as corporate social responsibility, put Folake in front of a camera as the face of a heartwarming campaign that would, Oh argued, generate more goodwill than any advertising budget could buy. Ji-seok listened to the pitch in full, noted its considerable commercial logic, and then said no in terms specific enough that no one in the room mistook it for a negotiating position. He did not explain his reasons to the board. He was still working out, in that meeting, how much of his answer was about protecting Folake, and how much was about a father who had finally learned what his son actually needed from him, and did not intend to let a press campaign undo it. Folake, unaware of the board meeting or its outcome, assumed the worst version of events, that someone connected to Ji-seok's company had leaked her identity to build exactly the kind of story his people ultimately wanted, regardless of what he'd told her personally. She confronted him at the pool the following day, voice level but unmistakably cold, and asked directly whether he or anyone working for him had spoken to a reporter about her. He said no, immediately and without hedging, and then, watching her face, understood that a flat denial wasn't going to be enough to undo a year of learned caution about powerful men and the stories built around them. "I don't know how she found me," Folake said, "but I know what happens next if this becomes public. I've watched it happen before." She did not accuse him outright a second time. She simply became, for the first time since they'd started speaking honestly, unreachable in a way that frightened him considerably more than the board meeting had. It took Ji-seok 2 days to trace the leak to its actual source, not his company at all, but a paramedic who had mentioned the rescue, without names, to a friend who happened to know Yoon Se-ra, and he brought the full account to Folake in person rather than by message, because he understood by then that trust rebuilt itself in rooms, not in texts. He also brought something else, written confirmation, sent that morning to the outlet's editor and copied to his own board, that Ilsong Group would not participate in, comment on, or in any way support a story naming the woman who had rescued his son, and that any attempt to publish details identifying her would be treated as a serious breach of the family's privacy. It was not, he told her plainly, a decision he'd made to protect the company's image. He said, watching her weigh whether to believe him, that he had spent a year learning what it cost people to be looked at without their consent, and did not intend to be the reason it happened to her. The statement Ji-seok eventually authorized, brief and unusually personal for a man who typically let his communications team handle every public word, did not name Folake, but it did something Director Oh had specifically advised against. It confirmed, in general terms, that his son had experienced a mental health crisis, that a stranger's intervention had saved his life, and that the family had asked, and would continue to ask, for that stranger's privacy to be respected absolutely, regardless of any story anyone tried to build around it. Oh warned him, accurately, that the statement invited exactly the scrutiny it claimed to want to avoid, and that a less transparent, more controlled version would have served the company better. Ji-seok told him, in front of 2 other board members, that he had not built the statement to serve the company. It was the first time in his professional life he had made a decision of that size explicitly against his own board's advice, and he did not spend much time afterward wondering whether it had been the right call. Folake read the statement 3 times before she believed it meant what it said, and then sat with the fact of it for several days before deciding what she actually wanted from what remained of the situation. She did not want a public role, a campaign, or a headline with her name in it, and she said so clearly when Ji-seok asked. What she wanted, she told him, was smaller and more specific: to keep coaching at the pool without anyone treating her differently for it, to finish her thesis on her own timeline, and to remain, if Min-jae wanted her to, a fixed point in a recovery that was still ongoing and would likely stay that way for a long time. She was careful to draw the line clearly. "I'm not disappearing," she said, "and I'm not becoming your family's good deed either. Those are the terms." Jisuk agreed to both without negotiation, which told her, more than the statement had, exactly how much had actually changed. The three of them sat together on the pool deck one evening after closing, an arrangement none of them would have predicted a year earlier. A CEO in shirt sleeves instead of a suit, a 15-year-old who had started sleeping through the night again, and a woman who had spent a year being found by increments rather than all at once. There was no dramatic speech. Min-jae said, mostly to the water, that he was glad she hadn't left her name blank forever. Folake said that some things were worth being found for, eventually, on her own schedule rather than anyone else's. Jisuk said very little, which had become, over the past months, his own particular way of showing up. They agreed, without much discussion, that things would continue roughly as they were: sessions, coaching, occasional dinners that Folak still sometimes declined without explanation, and that no one needed to name what exactly this had all become in order for it to keep being real. It was, Folake thought, watching the two of them argue lightly over which takeout to order, the quietest kind of family she had ever been allowed to belong to. By late autumn, the rhythm of all three lives had resettled around the pool without anyone deciding it formally. Folake finished a full draft of her thesis on a laptop the university's emergency fund had finally covered, working late in a library carrel that no longer felt like a stopgap, replacing something ruined. Min-jae's grades had not fully rebounded to where they'd been before the divorce, and Dr. Choi told his father more than once that this was an acceptable and even healthy outcome, evidence of a boy learning to want things for reasons that were his own, rather than performing an old version of achievement. The community program Jisuk had quietly funded now had a waiting list, new lane ropes, and a second part-time coach hired specifically to take pressure off Folake's schedule, though she still showed up most mornings out of habit as much as obligation. None of them called it healed, exactly. They called it, when pressed, still going, which struck all three as more honest. Jisuk kept the bracelet in the top drawer of his office desk for exactly 1 year, dried carefully after its months in an evidence bag, the red and gold thread slightly faded but intact. He had thought, more than once, about returning it earlier, but some instinct told him the gesture needed to mean something other than gratitude by the time he made it, and for most of that year, gratitude was still the only thing he had to offer. On an ordinary Thursday in April, almost exactly a year after the bridge, he brought it to the pool in a plain envelope and handed it to her without ceremony, the way you'd return something borrowed rather than something owed. "It's been in a drawer," he said, which felt worse the longer I thought about it than actually giving it back. Folake turned it over once in her hands, recognized her sister's pattern immediately, and tied it back onto her own wrist herself, silently, while he watched, neither of them making more of the moment than it needed to be. The district held a small youth invitational that spring, nothing prestigious, the kind of meet where parents outnumbered spectators and the trophies were modest, and Min-jae had entered the platform dive event Folake had once specialized in before her shoulder ended that particular ambition along with several others. He was nervous in the specific, practical way of someone who had trained seriously for the first time in his life, rather than merely attended sessions, checking his grip on the platform rail, running the approach in his head the way Folake had taught him to run it. Count, breathe, commit, no wasted motion. She stood on the deck below with a stopwatch she didn't strictly need for a dive, more out of habit than function, the same habit that had once kept her steady on a bridge railing talking a stranger's son back from an edge he never fully explained and had, by then, mostly stopped needing to. Jisuk found a seat in the modest stands, alone among a handful of other parents, watching his son approach a platform rather than a railing for the first time in over a year. Min-jae's dive was not perfect. His entry was slightly off vertical, the kind of small error a coach would flag and correct next week. But it was clean, deliberate, and entirely his own, the product of months spent learning to trust his body in water rather than fear it. Folake clicked the stopwatch at his entry, more from ceremony than necessity, glanced at a number that meant nothing officially and everything privately, and allowed herself, for the first time in the entire year since Mapo Bridge, something that looked almost like the satisfaction of a coach watching an athlete complete a race she herself had never gotten to finish. Jisok stood without quite meaning to when his son's head broke the surface, the automatic reflex of a father who had spent a year learning to notice things a moment sooner than before. Min-jae surfaced, found both of them on the deck immediately, and did not need to say anything about what the dive had actually meant to either of them. Some debts, Folake had come to understand, were never meant to be paid off cleanly. They were meant, instead, to become the ordinary shape of an ongoing life, ready, if anyone asked, to be picked back up tomorrow morning at the water's edge.